Good afternoon, my fellow citizens abroad. Good afternoon, my fellow citizens abroad. This is Dr. Teupa doing broadcasting and special comment, talking about the issue of declaring the end of the Korean War. And this issue is a hot topic nowadays among security experts on the Korean issues. And during the last 1 or 2 weeks' time, many American experts and also government officials, as well as South Korean government officials in charge of these issues, have exchanged views and have held talks formally and informally. As we all understand, the issue of declaring the end of the Korean War is not such a simple topic. It is such a complicated topic that should be discussed, fairly and publicly, with many considerations. Especially, we have to consider the general emotional approaches of general South Korean people who experienced the Korean War and still suffering from those bad memories, fighting against North Korean soldiers during the Korean War. And including myself, those who are more realistic on the security issues of the Korean Peninsula, I think even though Moon Jae-in leftist government is pushing ahead with this plan, and the United States should show more reluctance and more refraining remarks on the issue, so that we can save more time, because we are going to have a presidential election next year, March 9th, less than 5 months away. And this kind of hot security issues could affect on the result of the next year's presidential election. Also, it is so much questionable if our Moon Jae-in government push for an end of a war declaration is really based on wishful thinking rather than an accurate analysis of reality. So I again argue that Seoul and Washington ought to examine more carefully whether declaring an end to the war as a way to start dialogue is worth accepting the North's demands for the permanent suspension of the U.S. South Korea combined exercises and the deployment of U.S. military assets. Because dialogue itself is not meaningful. Dialogue for practical result is only meaningful if North Korea shows sincerity. As we all understand, North Korea has developed its nuclear weapons and missiles through repetition of a cycle of dialogue and provocation. And after certain type of provocations, like North Korea has shown in last month 4 times, and this month already one time, they are trying to repeat the cycle of dialogue and provocation, and that they will probably they'll be coming to the dialogue table after provocations with more conditions North Korea required from the United States and South Korea. It is true that Pyongyang has never given up on the ultimate objective of communizing the South Korea. And for North Korea, the declaration of the end of the Korean War is just one stepping stone on the path to that kind of goal. It is very important that whether Washington is fully understanding this kind of conspiracy hidden behind the end of the declaration of the war plan, something like that. And even the Moon Jae-in leftist administration should be more careful, more careful. If Seoul want an end of war declaration, to advance true peace on the Korean Peninsula, I think, we must, South Korean government must put more pressure on Pyongyang to first declare its nuclear weapons programs, and also then present its roadmap for scrapping them based on CVID schemes. Otherwise, dialogue for dialogue itself is not meaningful. And Washington this time, I think, must not be in a hurry in developing further progress, on the issue of declaring the end of the Korean War. And as we have been worrying about North Korea's, test firing of submarine-launched ballistic missiles and, ultra-speed gliding vehicle launching last month. This kind of launches are a serious threat, indeed. And I think, if North Korea truly want dialogue for producing substantial peace schemes, they must stop the vicious cycle of provocations and dialogue, and provocations and dialogue, something like that. I think it is true that Pyongyang has not changed its course of a past vicious cycle. And I think, unfortunately, amid this kind of no changes, I think, the Moon Jae-in leftist government is now too much absorbed in the push for a declaration of the end of the war, and as we all understand, which is technically still in a state of truce, when the truce agreement was signed in the year 1953. And I think, even though Seoul and Washington are said to have consulted and entered, consultations on the issue after a series of visits by the U.S. and by the South Korean government officials to each other's, territories, I think they should stop as of now, without North Korea's, fundamental changes. And I hope that Moon Jae-in administration, does not push in such a hurried way to our allied, countries, including Washington, and possibly to other United Nations, allied countries in the future. We all understand that this could be utilized as a leverage to push for entering into peace agreement and ultimately expelling American troops from the Korean Peninsula. This has been a traditional North Korean communizing strategy, into the South Korea, and it has not changed, since that time on. So Washington, as of now, even though they are inducing North Korea to come to dialogue table, I don't think Washington should touch on this hot issue, talking about declaration of the end of the war plan, something like that. And it is very much, worrisome that end of war discussions are in some part, on the way, and in some sense, welcomed by U.S. envoy visiting Seoul, Song Kim, special representative for North Korean affairs. But he clarified by saying that yesterday, after talks with our Korean counterpart, Mr. No Gyu-dok, chairman of the Korean Peninsula Peace Headquarters, something like that, negotiating headquarters, that North Korea should stop hostile provocations. This is first, and there will be no loosening measures against sanctions imposed by the United Nations Security Council and imposed by the U.S. Presidential Office. But as our government officials, including President Moon Jae-in and Foreign Minister Jung Woo-yong and National Security Director of Blue House, they all visited and talked about this issue and pushing more and more. In some sense, our allied country, U.S., has been in some sense, cornered, to talk on this issue with some progresses. But if they are talking about the content of the declaration, Washington should stop as of now. It's not helpful for South Korean security in the future. And I know that Seoul and Washington are reportedly discussing the content of a possible end of war declaration, and the frequent, recent visit back and forth has led analysis to speculate that the United States might be ready for take a more flexible attitude on this matter, but flexible attitude must be limited to just talking itself, to a more mutual analysis by exchanging views, and it must not go further to the stage where they actually accept the agenda to go to declare the end of a war plan, something like that. And still, it is also quite true that the goal of the United States remains the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, as Sung Kim said. And this is a very important goal of mutual talks on, especially talking about the Korean security issues. And if United States continues talking on this issue, probably the leftist administration will utilize this issue in the next year's presidential election campaign, helping leftist candidates Lee Jae-myung, because this government has been talking on the possible bilateral summit or possibly trilateral summit, possibly between Seoul and Pyongyang, and possibly Seoul, Pyongyang, Washington, or quadrilateral summit between Seoul, Washington, Pyongyang, and Beijing, something like that. But peace just by lip service and without substantial reductions of North Korean nuclear weapons will be a vague slogans without substantial reduction of security risks on the Korean Peninsula. So I hope that still the security issues must be focused on how to reduce numbers of nuclear weapons produced in North Korea, and possibly, as some scholars in the United States has raised the question of developing nuclear weapons in South Korea, by consulting with our allies in the United Nations Security Council, possibly, getting out of the membership of Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as we have analyzed and looking into the Article 10 and the number 1 clause there, that because South Korea is so much, threatened by the numbers of, dreadful North Korean nuclear weapons, we have valued reasons, to get out of the treaty and develop our own nuclear weapons after close consultation with our allied forces, especially United States, and also key members in the UN Security Council. However, still the key question is, our government, leftist government has that kind of intentions, or still our government, leftist government, is inclined to seek, peace by, lips, by only talks based on making paper contract, like Pyongyang Declaration, Panmunjom Declaration, something like that, which is meaningless. So next year's March 9th presidential election is on such an important momentum to change the wrong path road of Korean politics, and majority of South Korean citizens, I calculate about 70% of common sense South Korean citizens hoping that this kind of dangerous talks, regarding declaration of the end of the Korean War must be stopped as of now, even though our leftist government, Moon Jae-in, is pushing ahead with this topic. Instead, I want United States, put the agenda of making South Korea develop its own nuclear weapons, to protect its own citizens. it is, it is not premature as of now, even though we talk about this issue, because as everybody fully elaborated on the issue, and some experts and including scholars have talked about, it is, right time for us to talk about this issue. And the typical writing on this issue was, raised through the Washington Post, article written by Jennifer Lind and Daryl Press of the Dartmouth College in Washington, and they argued that South Korea must defend their citizens by their own nuclear weapons if United States cannot keep the nuclear umbrella promises in the future. This is logical. And as international system completely has failed to stop North Korea's further developing nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, this is very logical and very realistic as of now. Their logic is like this, that except these two scholars, like Bruce Bennett of Rand Cooperation in the United States. He also carried an article in the security magazine, The National Interest. He emphasized in the same context that as of now, because North Korea has developed the high technologies of ICBM, carrying ICBM with a nuclear warhead into the US territories, possibly killing millions of people there. Also, North Korea has developed submarine launched ballistic missile with nuclear warhead, and it also could possibly target at millions of US citizens without being detected in advance. Then, unlike the Korean War cases, if North Korea threatened to target US citizens when they make an attack into Seoul or South Korea, if they weren't like that, could Washington decide to counterattack North Korea with the measures, to eradicate those, war plans? And these scholars are arguing that it will be very difficult, imagining that if millions of American lives are sacrificed, then the public opinion of US citizens will not be favoring sending more weapons and more troops to the Korean Peninsula to deter, to stop, and to win the Korean War made by North Korea in an emergent situation. Which means that the nuclear umbrella promise has been broken already, and this is right time to protect the Korean citizens, 52 million Korean citizens' lives, by making South Korea develop its own nuclear weapons. Of course, there will be some resistances from, especially, Chinese Communist Party, which is a member of the National Security Council. But because China has not succeeded in restraining North Korea from stopping developing nuclear weapons, sometimes helping North Korea through secret, trade deals and sending them some oils, because they are brothers of Chinese Communist Party. And their relations in terms of security has been mouth and teeth relations, especially when they confront the United States Army in South Korea and the US, military policies in East Asia. The two countries are facing the same strategies, allied together. This is the realistic, analysis, and we South Koreans must understand that this kind of dangers, because it is already become a reality. When the issue of North Korea's nuclearization began in the year 1994, I think nobody expected at this kind of time. Everybody predicted that the nuclear program would be stopped in advance, but we made a deal, but North Korea broke down. We made a deal, but North Korea broke down. As of now, the number of nuclear weapons reaching 60s. Maximum, some experts, predict to be 100 even as of now. And with such an advanced missile technologies of ICBM and SLBM, with possible nuclear warhead on the missiles, how could we depend protecting South Korean lives in the future? So I again emphasize that the dangerous discussions, talking on declaring the end of a war plan must be stopped as of now. Before North Korea's denuclearization is completely, verifiably, irreversibly achieved in the future. And our leftist government must also stop discussing this issue and give up the dream of utilizing this issue in the next year's presidential election, inducing North Korea, help, to vote for Lee Jae-myung, current ruling party candidate in the next year's presidential election, who is a such an leftist-oriented, mind, and also who has been shouting, in some sense, anti-American slogans and more pro-Chinese Communist Party and pro-North Korean with more stances, So Washington must be fully aware of this kind of dangerous and hidden schemes. And Washington must stop discussing further on the issue of declaring the Korean war ending scheme, something like that. So I hope the future talks between Washington and Seoul, especially regarding security issues, must be focused on how to denuclearize North Korean nuclear weapons, also how to dismantle all the weapons of mass destruction, including chemical and biological weapons. I again emphasize, no more talks on the declaration of the end of the war, and instead focus on denuclearization of North Korea's nuclear weapons. This is my comment today. Thank you.